Okay, should we start, or are people still having soup outside? If not, let's just start. Welcome to my session, Help My Search Page is Getting Hammered by a Bot, or more specifically, it's getting hammered by an AI bot. You might have come across something if you are kind of a site builder or maintainer of a website where you suddenly find really weird, like search or in your log you find that access to pages that continuously have the same argument in the past are showing up, and you have no idea why. And as a site builder, you first of all go, shit, did I break something? What happened? Or you might come across of this problem when you look at articles like this in Ars Technica a few weeks ago that basically describes how big companies are actually setting up mazes, labyrinths for AI bots to keep them circling around so that they're not bringing sites down. You might have heard of Wikipedia, which have a traffic increase of about 50% just by AI bots hitting every single pass, but also generating passes that don't make any sense. So no matter whether you're coming more from the person that needs to deal with these weird search requests, passes, or whether you come from the more interest in how are we dealing with this on a more global scale, I hope there's something in this session for all of you. Just a bit about myself. My name is Antje. You find me in the issue queue as Ifrik. I'm a freelancer, so I give myself my own job title, which is Building Websites for a Better World. I have been using Drupal since about 4.6, when we built a website for a party. And you find me both on Drupal.org and on Mastodon, both under Ifrik. And for the next few days, also in the contribution room. But let me also introduce my examples that I'm going to be using. These come from two different websites that are run for NGOs, non-profit organizations, that have decades, years of content. I think one of the sites got migrated from a post-nuke something to Drupal 4.4 or so. So they have decades, years of text. So we built them a faceted search. And they really like tagging their content. Like that, they tag content with about 5, 6 different tags. The other website is working with a lot of different organization funding partners. So they have about 120 partners that they work with. Some of them only on 1 report or 2, others on maybe 50, 60. So facets makes a lot of sense there. But facets are actually making the search pages that currently are getting hammered by AI bots. So just as an example of, these are the kind of sites I'm thinking of. So the question, when you build a site, either as a site builder or site builder in a small agency or in a bigger one, is okay, what can we do about this? But let's do a short recap I forgot to ask actually who's in the room, as in the, who's here is more of a site builder? Okay. Who's a module developer? Who does a lot of front-end theming? Back-end? Okay. So I think we have a really wide range of people. I just do a short recap to say what I'm talking about. So what is a search page when I mean search page? It's something we set up by actually adding an index, adding the fields to a search index, either the database or Solr. We put them in a view, either as indexed fields or as rendered entities. So we make a view that should bring up all the search results. Then we configure all the facets. As you can see, this is one that has about 12, 13 facets on the list there. You can set them up as checkboxes, as links, You can say, should the ID be turned into the label of the, for example, the taxonomy term, the vocabulary, all of those kind of things. So you do that under facets, and then you go and place the whole thing as blocks. So kind of 4 different places so far. And that makes you what I would call a search page. It's something that shows you, in this case, the facet blocks on the left here. They can look like tick boxes or radio buttons or something, but they are in fact links. It quite often has an exposed additional full text search at the top. It might have sorting options, and then it has a list of the actual search results in the middle. These are usually rendered entities. They are loaded from the database. I know we have indexed this into the search index, but usually what is getting displayed here is still coming from the database. So for every single research result, it's loaded from the database, and that takes a certain amount of time. But it's also creating a path that you see at the bottom there that, for example, gives you, in this case, that the language that is selected is English and that the type is a press release. All of that goes into this URL that you see at the bottom, and that is getting longer and longer the more facets you select. So what is good to know, actually, before you engage on anything about doing these search bots hitting your site, is actually making sure that you know whether these are rendered entities or not. Quite often in the documentation that you find on Drupal.org, it might say, oh, and now just use xdebug to see whether it does what you want to do or not. Lots of site builders might have not set that up, or it takes a long time to figure out where the hell to check that. So I've given you actually the path here that where I simply put a DSM in to say, okay, are these nodes loaded? Or are there any nodes loaded? You can do that on the front-end page. Another tip is to actually just do that in the preview of the view when you configure it, because then no other entities are loaded. Nothing that shows up in the footer or in the menu or anything. You just see the nodes that are getting loaded by that view. In this case, it's just listing the node IDs. So it's good to actually do that before you engage into doing anything, because otherwise you won't know whether you have put your DSM in the wrong place and nothing shows up, or whether it's actually working and nothing shows up. So do it early. Sorry. So back to facets. So as I said, the arguments that are in a facet show up in the path, and that path is getting longer and longer. So in this case, it's an example of the author has been selected as Miller. It's a press release. The language is English. The partner organization is number 77, whichever that was. The region or country was 20, and the topic under which it was filed is number 3. But you can generate those paths. You can say, well, maybe I just want everything that has Miller and Smith as an author. So you can actually just you can just write this URL that's getting longer and longer. I do that quite often when I need to link directly to a pre-filtered search page. But it also means that this can just be generated automatically by an AI. And then it comes up with stuff on well, give me everything that happens in London and Amsterdam at the same time. Doesn't make any sense. Give me anything that is in topic 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, whatever. So this is the problem that we're dealing with when generative AIs are creating search paths. And they're not doing that once. They might come back every 6 hours. Even for a site that's only publishing a new article every week, they might still come back every 6 hours. So you stand there and say, gosh, what are we doing with this? Because this can really bring down your site. So the first thing is think, okay, well, maybe we should use robot no-follow text. Yeah, that's not respected. It's probably there, it's simply not respected. Next thing is, Well, maybe we should cache the results. I know the default by now is not to cache search results in the view, but especially if you have a site that is much older, it might still be set to actually cache the results. And also, as a site builder, when you have issues with performance, probably the first thing you hear is, have you set up the caching correctly? So you might be actually caching your view. One of the sites I showed had the view cached. Within hours, my database exploded from 2 gigabytes to 18 gigabytes, at which point the hosting kind of put the whole website on read-only. I couldn't even go in and clear the cache anymore. So you need to turn off the caching, unfortunately, here. And then maybe an option is, as a stopgate measure, to actually only allow logged-in users to go to the search page. It still means these URLs might be generated, but at least they can't be loaded by the bot anymore. But that only works for specific sites. And it's also really annoying that we have to build walls around our own sites just so that they're not getting taken down by AI bots. So then the next question quite often that comes is, well, can't we just use Cloudflare? Well, I think there's different opinions about Cloudflare and whether we want to use it or not. I've got one site that is very much based about privacy online and GDPR and cookies and everything. They cannot use Cloudflare. So it might be an option for some. It might be an option for some that can afford it, or that, but it's not an option for everybody. So what can we do? Well, we can first of all also talk to our hosting, our DevOps. In the example that I had, where the website was put in read-only mode, which is a kind of community hosting, they came back to me within an hour and actually said, you know what, for now, we're just going to restrict access to anything that has more than 2 ampersands. So basically anything that has more than 3 facets selected, we block that, full stop. That works. It means the bot doesn't actually hit your site. It's actually getting blocked much earlier. But there's a good reason to say, I want to know everything, every report that Miller wrote in English that is about something happening in Brazil. And I wouldn't be able to do that anymore. But it does work as a stopgate measure. When you are in the period that you run into this problem and you need to do something, this is a simple thing that, with a few lines of code that were given to me, can be done. But usually as a site builder, so you can't go to your hosting and say, can you put that in somewhere? And they ask you, do you know what it's doing? And I say, I know what it's supposed to do. I've got no idea whether this code makes sense. It works if you have a good hosting provider that you can talk to. In the last 2.5 weeks, since I've given this presentation the first time, somebody has actually written a very simple module for this. It's called Facet Bot Blocker, where in the GUI you can actually say, okay, block this if it has more than 3 parameters, 2 parameters. It's a simple thing you can actually do, but the description also said that if you have a web application firewall that you can configure, do it there. Because even with this Facet Bot Blocker, the bot will still get to your site. It will still be part of your bandwidth, your everything, you're part of your website, while if it can be blocked already on the access to the server, that's much better. There are some other options in terms of rate limiting and banning, for example, using fail to ban, which this is another example that was given to me after the Drupal Camp England, that basically bans every IP number that in 60 minutes has done more 100 failed attempts. Right. Any bot that makes more than 100 attempts in 5 minutes that are failed, like that go to a page that doesn't exist, they will be banned for 60 minutes. I think they told me that that documentation was old. They have wrapped it up to be being banned for 24 hours now. It is quite brutal. It is also, especially when bots using different IP addresses. It can also be problematic when you have a website that, like a similar website, I was planning at some point to turn using facets, which was based in Malaysia and China. When you come to the point that you're blocking the whole Alibaba cloud access, you're also blocking all the users there. So, but it's one of the tools in the whole arsenal that we have. So once you have talked to your DevOps on what they can do on that end, it comes back to what can we do as site builders? And there are actually some interesting options, which is reducing the site load with Solar Search, or the page load, and using Facet 3 with Ajax and better exposed filters, and possibly also adding some spam protection. The nice thing about that is that you can actually start doing this even if you don't have this problem, because it's actually improving the search UX. So you have a win-win situation. You have a nicer search UX, and you have more protection of dealing with these bots. So let me go through this, how we're doing this. So for reducing the page load with Solar Search, actually the maintainers of Search API Solar have written nice documentation for that. The links are in the slides. I give the QR code to the slides also at the end again. So basically what we're doing is, first of all, create a search view that doesn't load the entities. It doesn't load the entities from the database. It just takes them directly out of the Solar index. And we're actually storing and displaying rendered HTML, so that we're not still having to load the entities. So there's a lot of different places where you need to tick something. I'm just going through them step by step so you have an idea also for the module developers in the room, actually to see how we're using your modules. So first of all, on the Search API, there's a tick box somewhere under Advanced at the bottom that says, retrieve results from Solar. That means that if the results do exist in Solar, it's taken from there. It doesn't bother looking at the database anymore. Then we actually index rendered content. So when you add a field to your search index, you can actually also add a whole rendered entity. Quite often that is done if you want to get the whole text for full text search, or combine it with other fields for full text search. You do that as a general field. So you can actually also add your node or any other entity here with different view modes. So typically I would put in a field here as a search index view mode that just says, okay, give me all the fields that have wording, that have words in them, leave all the other fields out, because I want to be able to search through them. Here I will actually index them as a search result or as a teaser, so that it just has the same fields on it that you would put on it if it's a teaser, or when it's a teaser. And then you have to make sure that the HTML is not getting stripped, because Search API is really good at stripping of all of this unnecessary HTML usually, because we don't want diffs and H2s and everything in the search index, because usually it doesn't make sense. You're not searching for diff and coming up with a lot of text that says diff somewhere. So you do that by saying this should be rendered as storage only. And then under the processors, there are at least 3 different tick boxes. You have to make sure they're disabled. So it shouldn't strip the HTML. It shouldn't ignore the case, because if you're referring to an image file, you want to know that the case is correct, because otherwise it won't be finding it. And it shouldn't ignore characters, because otherwise you have your HTML text in there, but with no brackets around it. There might be some other processors that are stripping HTML. If it doesn't work, check that first, because depending on your setup, there might be more plugins in the search that doing this kind of thing. And we are basically working around the usual setup of Search API here. And now you go back to your view, and you only display one single field. You're displaying the field that has the rendered entity in it, and nothing else. Oh, you also have to make, first of all, you have to make sure that your query settings are set to skip access checks. Usually the view will check whether the user has access to whatever you're trying to show to them. To do that, they need to load the entity. We don't want to load the entity. So you have to make sure that in your index you have properly set that only the stuff that should be visible to the user is indexed. And then you can skip this access control here. And then you add just this one field that has your rendered content in it. And there again, you have to say that it should have the HTML allowed. So I think this is so far the 6 or 7 places where I've told Drupal not to get rid of the HTML. But when you do that, then you have a search page that basically looks like it does before. It just renders your search results. But now if I look at my DSM, it won't come up with any node ID. And if I put a DSM to check what is actually in the rows of the view, you will see that this field, the rendered search result, actually starts with angle bracket article. It has all the div classes. It has the path to the image, which is off the screen that side. So it has the full HTML in there. So this means we don't have any entity loads on the search page for these search results. There might still be entity loads if you have blocks in the footer or so, but I'm just only talking about the search results here. So that gives you much faster and smoother results, but unfortunately it doesn't actually stop the bots yet. But it's a UX improvement, and it's a nice thing to do to start with. And then we move to using facet 3. So facets is this way of saying, let's index all the tags, the taxonomy terms, the language, the content types, and then let users kind of filter down on what they want to see, typically also with a number of how many things there are actually. And in facets 2, as you see here, that's doing a page load every time you select a facet. So these things on the left, they are links, and it's just adding them into the path. And I just see that my field at the top is very short, so you can't quite see, but the path is getting longer and longer there. If you upgrade to facet 3, it just looks like this. So it doesn't do a page load. It's using Ajax to just show you the same, loading the part of the page that has new content in it, and you see in the top that the URL doesn't actually change. It keeps on just being //search. That's a difficult one. So how do we get there? Well, once you have upgraded to facet 3, you can actually go back to your view. There's 2 things yet you have to check that they are set. One is that obviously that Ajax should be turned on. And you have to make sure that you're not displaying your exposed filters in a block. Because what the Ajax on the view does is only change what's in the row of the views. It doesn't change any other blocks on the page. So if you expose your facets in a block to place them, for example, in a sidebar, the content of the page is getting nicely reloaded without doing the full page load, but the facets on the side stay the same. And that kind of contradicts the idea of facets. So you have to make sure that that is turned off. But then you can actually add the facets just as filters. So no more snowflakes or anything. You just go to the filter criteria and say, well, actually I want to have the author as a facet here, or the content type, or whatever other field I put in the search index. And for each of them, you can actually configure them as you configured facets before. with one exception, I'll come to that, but for the rest, it's actually still all living in the view here. And then you can go to the exposed filter settings, especially if you use better exposed filters. You can now say, okay, should this be displayed as a drop-down, as checkboxes, as links? So that makes it much easier when you're building a site, because everything just lives in the view now. You don't have to go to different places anymore to set up everything and making sure that all your blocks for your facets are in the right place and everything. So that makes it it makes a better experience for the visitor, and it makes a much better experience for the site builder. So that's a triple win. So once you've done that, you will actually see that now everything is in this exposed search, or in this exposed filters. The full text search, the facets, the options for sorting, and then of course the submit button and the reset button if you have one. So all of that is one form, which means in order to get to the facet, you need to submit that form. And we know that bots don't like submitting forms, so we're already one step further here. However, if you have a lot of facets, or very long facets, it starts looking like this. They just become very long, unyielding, because they all live together in this one search form at the top of your view. You can try collapsing them, but again, that is a bit unyielding. So you can get around with that with actually creating a custom template for your view. I don't know why, but for some reason, the views template do not show up in the Twig suggestions, but they work. I've given the example on how that should look like at the bottom there. So you can make custom templates for whole views, and then you can see that exposed, that's the whole list of exposed filters. You can, for example, put them in a div that you place into something that will look like a sidebar. It's still the full page content, but you can make it look like a sidebar so that it fits with the rest of your site design. So that solves the problem that maybe these facets are all too long and keep on pushing the content down. But then I came across another problem, and that is that pretty much, for some reason, every single site I'm maintaining has a little search field in the banner region, in the header region. Usually that's I've exposed my filters in a block, so I can place them as a block on a different page, and when I put something in there, it brings me back to the search page. That works fine, except from now I can't expose it in a block, because then the AJAX doesn't work anymore on my search page. Again, there's two simple ways around that. Either you just make a full text, full HTML custom block and just put a little bit in there that actually makes that form. That simply says, okay, put whatever should go into this search API full text field. That's the name of my field there. Everything that should go into there. And when you submit it, go to the search page. There is also a small module for that called Simple Search Form that has existed apparently for a while. It does need a bit of UI love, because I think get parameter is not necessarily common vocabulary for your average site builder. But it works quite well to simply put that little search field in a banner or in a footer or wherever you want to have it. Just leaves us with one problem, and that is Facets 2 has this really nice thing called soft limit, where you can say, okay, just initially only show me 3 results or 5 results. Especially if you have a lot of facets, you can just kind of put them all underneath each other, and the user sees the kind of first 3 or 5 words. They have an idea what this facet might be about, and if they want to see more, you click more, and then you get all of the rest. Since Facet 3 has moved all of this exposed filter thing to views or better exposed filters, we've lost that. There's an issue for better exposed filters to come up with something like a soft limit. There is an issue number for this. If anybody is looking for something to do for the next 3 days, you would make me really, really happy if you would do that. So, as a summary, Facet 3 is really, really great for sites that don't have too many facets or too many facet items. If it has many facets or facet items, it does need some additional work with strict templates so to actually make it look good. The no soft limit might be a problem for some sites or others. And in terms of when it comes to search bots, we now have a form. We don't have links in the past anymore. We have a form that needs submitting. And that we can then, on top of that, we can now throw some anti-spam measures like anti-bot. Anti-bot is one of the modules, for example, that says you require JavaScript to submit a form. And again, that's not something that bots typically do. So if we combine, first of all, indexing a rendered entity, reducing the page loads that way. If we use filters in a form as facets by using Facet 3, if we use AJAX to, again, avoid more page loads and avoid changing the path URL, plus additionally using, protecting the form with something like anti-bot, and additionally talking to our hosting providers to set up WAF or use Facet Bot Blocker if you can't. Then we actually have quite a few tools that bring together a way of stopping the AI bots hitting our search page. So that was quite a lot, I think, but thank you very much for coming. And instead of saying, okay, do you have any questions? I actually like asking also you some questions about, is there any other contrib modules site builders can use? Is there any other custom solutions people have? And if so, could we also turn them into modules? Thanks. I got a microphone, which is turned. Is that turned? Yeah. I think there's a recording, so I should give you the microphone.
So a couple of things. First off, thanks for a great session, very informative. Also, I would appreciate if you could go back to the previous slide at some point so I can get a picture. In terms of other contrib modules, there is one called crawl rate limit that for bots, basically what it can do is if they start to do the request too often, you can set a threshold and then basically it'll start serving them 417 responses, so too many requests. And that's a way to basically slow it down. So it won't solve the problem, but again, it can be a way to sort of like stop it from overwhelming your site. So
okay.
Another one to try.
How was that module called again?
Crawl rate limit, it's called.
Okay, cool,
so.
Thanks. I would add that to the slides for the next presentation. Okay, any other questions, comments? Have I shocked all of you? Do you maybe mind doing the microphone? Cool, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much for the session. I just have one comment about the Facets 3. There is a submodule, Facets expose filters, that you need to enable so it appears in the view. So just people know this. Because out of the box, it doesn't have the views filters. And about other modules, there is also a Search API decoupled that has another display of the results, not in the view, but as a decoupled endpoint, but it still has some UI for semi-decoupled. So you can still build your search page in UI, but it's not the view anymore. So that also might help, because then the JavaScript components create their own logic how to pass the parameters to endpoint, and it might be that AI will not find how to do this. And then one more about the restricting AI bots. So you said, of course, they don't respect the robots.txt, but there is now a movement for the LLM.txt file that should be like a standard for AI crawlers. So maybe you can also mention this next time. There is a movement now, and there is a llmtxt.org page where you can check the standard. So it's similar to what robots.txt was doing for other bots, but this is only for LLMs.
And we hope they respect that.
Yes.
Thank you. So that was a decoupled search.
Yes, search API decoupled.
Search API decoupled. Okay. I hope I remember all of them afterwards. There's a
Just to mention another tool for those using Varnish. There's a Varnish plugin. I don't know if that's a module plugin for Varnish, but it's called Varnish Throttle. I don't know if I pronounce well, where you can limit the number of requests from the same IP.
IPA.
It's the same way you can do it with other server tools, but inside Varnish. So even before it goes, well, it's okay like this. Sorry for the English.
No problem. I think there's not that many actually native English speakers in the room, so we do this. We can also do this multilingual if somebody feels more comfortable in some other languages. I think you had a.
For most of the presentation, you were talking about defensive tactics, but at the beginning you mentioned, what comes to mind is like Cloudflare's AI Labyrinth, which is an offensive tool. Do you have concerns about offensive tools and how they're utilized?
No. I think defending an open web is quite important, and any offensive tools for that is also really useful. I was just focusing this one more on what I can do from the point of somebody that actually deals with the Drupal site. Yes, I think the Ars Technica article has quite a lot of these interesting examples of building labyrinths that kind of send the bots round in circles. And it's really good that people are dealing with that. It's just not my area of expertise. But I think we do also need to defend some of the open web we have.
So first, thank you for the great presentation. We should really add this recording to the Search API documentation.
You're welcome.
I have a few notes. So you said that when the view in facets 3, when you expose the form, the exposed form, when you put it in a block, there is a patch for it, so it also works with Ajax. So it's a core issue, and if you want, I can give you the link to it.
Yes, and we have 3 days to get that patch review turned in then.
Also, if you enable Ajax in facets 3, you can also use the Views Ajax history module if you want to get the URL updated so it follows the Ajax calls, and then you can copy the URL. Because in your presentation you only showed it when it stays the same URL, but there's a module for that.
Actually, in this case, I preferred having the same URL because it doesn't kind of leak that information to a bot.
True.
But there are quite a lot of cases where you might want to link to a pre-filtered view, or you want to bookmark one. So therefore, that would be really helpful, yes.
Okay, and as last, I'm already working on a soft limit patch, so it's probably it will be fixed in a few days.
And for anybody who doesn't know, this is one of the maintainer facets, so thank you. Any other questions?
Hey, thank you for a great presentation. I'm not sure if you're aware of the AI crawlers in general, you know, like Firecrawl, that is, well, nowadays apparently they are the next type of crawlers. So they are context-aware agent type AI crawlers. So if it's a form, doesn't matter. If it's not a form, doesn't matter. They just work fine like any other human beings with your website. They just click all the facets, wait for the AJAX calls to finish, even read the website, take out the context out of it, and then crawl it. I just did a project on it recently. It works marvelously, actually, works fine. And this probably doesn't work in the long run. So I assume we need to find and figure out and detect the bot in itself, you know, instead of, I don't know, putting things in front of it. So I suspect, I don't know what's the solution though. You know, it's moving that way, it will work. They will crawl anyways, so.
Yeah, and I think in general, for most sites, we also have an interest in them actually crawling the site and indexing that so that you can also find things when you search for it. And if it just hits all of the facets that are there, that would still be fine by me. It's when it's adding this thousands of links that don't go anywhere that are taking down the sites. If we can at least get rid of that. But yes, we also still need to keep an eye on all of the things that are coming up and both defensive and offensive ways of trying to deal with that. I came up with the wording of maybe we need some kind of sustainably sourced AI results that are don't relying on sites that are just kind of crawling everything and bringing everything to a standstill. But yeah, that's a more philosophical question probably. Any other questions or so? Otherwise, I will be in the contribution room in the next days, so I'm also happy to give people a hand on if they are either looking at these issues that are open or if they want to implement that for the site they're working on. Well, and I thank you all for coming and have a nice 3 days.
Good job.
Thanks.
like really well done. So to get started with Nuxt, you basically you start a new project by doing npm create Nuxt latest, and it will ask you a couple of questions, and you basically you are ready to go. And then you just start your dev server with npm run dev. It just starts your local development server. The typical thing is, you might know it from the JavaScript world, with hot module reloading and everything. It just refreshes whenever you do So in this demo environment, there's also like the icon module and the Tailwind module up and configured. So you can like basically do like markup like this, and it will just render it and show it on the right side. So here is the icon. It's like the Drupal icon. So if we change it, you'll see it goes away, and it also has like Drupal inside. Here the classes is just Tailwind, so I made the text a little bit larger and made it blue. Can also have a red Drupal if you prefer. So, but I guess what makes it more interesting is to maybe create a new component and say, like, I don't know, let's do like a Drupal icon. I mean, you don't need it, but the template. And then I could just go and move that over. And instead of using it here, I can now just use my Drupal icon. And here it is. And I can also pass like some additional classes here, and it will merge it. I don't know, let's say, add some additional margin to the left, and it will just jump over and also to the top. Yeah, that's it. So quite convenient to work with, I would say. Any questions to that, maybe?
Why the icon is red?
You're right, it should be blue. Drupal is blue. Okay. So where are we? Everything I think that you need basically for front-end development is there, or there's a Nuxt module available. So I think like developer experience is pretty great. So I think that's quite convenient to work with, in particular, considering it's the same technology, server-side, client-side. You don't have to think about that boundary so much anymore. It's just the same way of working with it. So you can just write the HTML, the CSS as usual. You don't have to know JavaScript for doing that. I mean, like for defining some props, it's just syntax. You can then, of course, embrace some Vue if you like, but you don't have to. But I think, yeah, it's pretty powerful. But you may wonder, yeah, aren't JavaScript frontends bad for performance? So I think that question really relates also to how you actually render your JavaScript and how you serve it to your visitors. So I would like to go a little bit into the rendering modes available for JavaScript frontends, or in Nuxt in particular. So the Nuxt rendering modes are basically, first off, client-side rendering, which is the most simple one, which means there's no server involved. Basically, when you build your application, Nuxt will just generate a very simple static index HTML, which also contains the JavaScript. So it's basically empty, just loads your JavaScript and then runs Nuxt in the browser and does everything in the browser. You can use that if you'd like to run a complete application, like, I don't know, an internet, where it's not important to have SEO or a big or the best first load performance. It might really be good enough for that. But then, as said, like server-side rendering might be really convenient for the other use cases, like where SEO is really important. There, like everything would be just rendered on the server, and like a server returns like a proper, fully rendered HTML website, which is great for initial load performance. So like also like users, they get to load the whole website, and then they already see everything, and only later on the JavaScript kicks in. So it's also great for the first load performance. Then there's also static site generation. That's basically the approach where like everything is pre-built at build time. So not only the Nuxt application, but it would also go for all your routes and pre-build all the sites and into static HTML. But it's quite actually nice for smaller content sites, I would say, because then you can very easily host it statically. What's the most robust and most cheap way to serve sites like this, right? And still, you can have some interactivity with JavaScript while doing that, of course. Then there's hybrid rendering. That's actually a nice option of Nuxt that you can mix the approaches together. You can like deploy a server, but still have some routes which are like pre-rendered at build time. So if you like, you can really mix and match by route. But for server rendering, I think it's actually quite important when you work with it that you understand how server rendering actually works. So first off, the pages are like pre-rendered on the server, or rendered on the server actually. So when the user loads the page, it already gets the fully rendered website. The page is transferred to the browser, it's rendered in the browser. As you mentioned before, the user already sees it, it has the CSS, the HTML, everything is there. Then the JavaScript loads, and once the JavaScript is loaded, also the Nuxt app is loaded in the browser, and then it hydrates. That means it's actually the Nuxt app is started, and it continues to run where it stopped running at the browser. And from there on, the Nuxt app runs in the browser and will have the full interactivity, reactivity from Vue.js when you want it and when you need it. So hydration, what is that? It's actually really the process and like the thing that makes Nuxt resume in the browser. The way it works is that basically when Nuxt has rendered the page on the server, is that it also ships the data that it used to render the page to the client. So it records that payload, and that payload will just be transferred to the client as JSON. Then on the client side in the browser, then the app is rerun with that payload. So that means the whole Vue components and everything is instantiated again, and it's so-called mounted to the DOM. So it means the Vue component, it's instantiated in a JavaScript runtime, and it's also mounted to the DOM elements which are already in the HTML. And once that is done, then the app is considered active and running, so then it's fully hydrated. So that's also good to know that this works, because there's also like a thing that can come up with applications like Nuxt, which is a hydration mismatch, which can happen to you if you, for example, write non-well-formed HTML. Like, for example, if you have a table element, within like a table row, you can only have like the table cells. If you violate that, the browser will repair actually the markup for you, but that's not done on the server side. So then actually the markup which is produced on the server side and which is produced on the client side, it won't match anymore, and this is the hydration mismatch. So if you run into hydration mismatch problems, it's probably due to that. So it's that's something good to know and to be aware of. Yeah, so what are some of the Nuxt features else that are available? I guess it's generally good to know what it's there, so I'd like to give you a little bit of an overview of also what it's there, although you don't have to use it, of course. There are plenty of features available, but you rarely have to use everything, I guess. But of course, when you need something, it's good to know what is there. First off, something which is actually done behind the scenes for you is the bundling magic. So Nuxt, of course, bundles the JavaScript and the CSS efficiently, so the generated markup and HTML application is performant. And it does that by using Vite by default, or you could also like opt to using Webpack. But the nice thing is actually it abstracts that away for you. So you don't have to take care of configuring Vite usually, unless you want to customize it. It's just really good production ready configured out of the box. And it's also configured in a way it's efficient in that it does automatic code splitting by routes automatically. So if you define multiple routes in Vue, it will automatically take care of making JavaScript chunks for the dedicated routes. And also, like if you have some components which you might want to decide to lazy load, it will also take care of making a separate chunk for that. So that's quite convenient, and really no configuration needed there. So, like, what are the things available in Nuxt? So the main concepts, I would say, first off, components, Vue components, of course. Seen that. Also composables, we already seen, like it's basically reusable Vue helpers. It's also something you can very easily use in Nuxt. Then there are these pages, the controller components, which auto-register the routes. Then there's also a special thing called layouts. Now, layouts is basically like a site template, like a page template if you like, which has the header, the footer, typical the things of your site which are not changing by route. And you can have like basically register multiple layouts and then switch it by route. Also quite handy if you need that. Then there's a feature called server routes, which basically is very neat for like making API endpoints as part of your Nuxt server. Nuxt plugins are like a separate thing which allows you to run code whenever the Vue application starts. Particularly handy also if you need to register some additional Vue plugins or something like that. Then middleware is a thing which is run before navigating to a new route. So this is a special, because like you have client-side navigation, it also like runs if you navigate like on the client side, but also it runs the first time on the server. So that's that middleware. It's like always server client side. But then server middleware is a special thing like which runs only on the server before a request is handled. So this is like middleware as you would know it from Drupal. Nuxt hooks, yeah, something familiar for Drupal as well. Yeah, you have hooks to hook into the Nuxt lifecycle. So if you want to extend it, customize some things, there are like a couple of hooks available for that, which in particular then are handy when you write and want to develop Nuxt modules. So you can use the Nuxt modules to implement those hooks, but also with Nuxt modules you can all provide all of the other things basically. You can provide components, plugins, middleware. So a Nuxt module basically is a reusable NPM package which allows you to package some Nuxt functionality up as a reusable module and expose some configuration options, of course. Yeah, that said, extensibility via modules obviously is a big thing, which we have already seen with the use cases. It's quite handy, and there's also like a big ecosystem of open source modules available. So there's the registry at nuxt.com/modules where everyone can just register his own modules. And there are also some official modules which are maintained by the Nuxt team. Some of those you have already seen, like the image module or the fonts module. But there are also more, like there's an ITN module for multilingual websites, or there's this Nuxt UI module, which adds in a special Nuxt UI component library, which is also maintained by the Nuxt team. But of course, there's also like many useful community modules, like there's, for example, Nuxt JSON API module, which is a JSON API client, or there's this Nuxt.js Drupal CA module, which is one of the modules that we are maintaining. It's connecting Nuxt to Drupal via custom elements. Another thing that Nuxt has available and is maybe not popularly used, but can also be quite handy, is Nuxt layers. Nuxt layers is basically a possibility to reuse Nuxt apps or parts of Nuxt apps across projects. So you can basically, when you have a Nuxt application just say, okay, extend this other Nuxt application. And you would do it like as you would see here, like with that extends key in the configuration, you basically can just locally refer to another layer, or also like to layers published at NPM or at GitHub. So that's actually handy for doing reusable things, like maybe you want to package up some reusable themes and use it on multiple websites. Or maybe it's also just like if you have a very large code base and you want to organize your code more nicely, you can split it up into multiple layers and just also develop it in one repository. For the Nuxt server-side thing, there's a special server engine developed by the Nuxt team, which is called Nitro. Basically, it's the server which is used by Nuxt internally, and it serves the routes and the API endpoints. And also, like when you run Nuxt in server mode, it does like trigger the server-side rendering of your Vue.js application and everything. It's serverless and edge compatible, that's quite handy. It's possible because it's very efficient. So the produced JavaScript is very tiny, and it even does something like code splitting on the server. So every route and everything is very optimized to test the smallest memory footprint possible, and all the things. So that way, it's also possible to deploy it on serverless environments. For example, I don't know, S2 functions or Cloudflare workers. It's also platform agnostic. So that said, it's like same thing. You can run it on Node.js server, but also like in some other edge runtime. The Nitro server engine, it's part of the AnJS ecosystem. That actually is an interesting ecosystem which is also maintained and was started by the Nuxt team. It's a collection of JavaScript utilities. It's exposing reusable packages, and they figured like Nuxt is solving lots of problems. Why not just expose it as generally usable packages so everyone can use it? And they just started doing it, and that way they also created Nitro. And it actually really took off. It's becoming quite popular, and many of those packages are used like everywhere in the JavaScript world. And Nitro specifically, for example, is used by Astro for the server-side rendering part, also like by Solid Start, another JavaScript framework. So it's quite nice, actually, that this is working out so well. Yeah, but you might wonder, now, how can you use Nuxt together with Drupal? Yeah. So let's take a quick look at that. First off, you can just use Drupal as any other system with Nuxt. You can just use custom data fetching to fetch some data from Drupal and then render it with Nuxt. So this is how you would typically do it, like in, for example, in a page component, but can be every kind of view component. There's like the composable provided by Nuxt use fetch, which is basically a simple HTTP client, which then also parses the JSON, and like in this example, like just an API of articles, and then makes it available. So with the articles JSON, you can just work as usual then in your template, like loop over it, render it. So of course, like that's a simpler example, but I guess it gives you an idea. Yeah, but the issue basically with that kind of thing is, I mean, it's easy to get started like this, but if you think about a whole application, if you want to have like everything, like, I don't know, SEO, metadata, or maybe a login, there's always a lot of things to develop, right? And Drupal already gives us a lot. And if you do like a decoupled application, this is always a little bit of a problem that we are throwing so much away. And this is really why actually we started with Lupus decoupled Drupal, the decoupled Drupal stack that we are developing, with the idea in mind that we keep using as much as possible of like what Drupal already provides us. And it basically, what our stack does, it gives like a fully integrated solution with, by default, the Nuxt frontend. You can also use others, but Nuxt is the primary default frontend we are developing also as first-class frontend with it. And the way it works is basically that it renders every Drupal page just in a JSON response. So it's like for every Drupal route, like if you would do /blog with a view, you can basically then get a JSON response of that route, and served with like in an array of high-level front-end components, which in our case are the custom elements. So that way, Drupal keeps in control of many things like paths, path aliases, routing, metadata, or the caching logic, that all just stays there. And also we introduced recently a new thing, custom elements UI, which actually makes it possible to use it as a low-code solution. So with custom elements UI, you have something like manage display on an entity. You also have like manage custom elements, where you can just configure how you would transform an entity view mode into those custom elements, high-level components. So basically, you can configure then how you would like the data output so that your Nuxt application can consume it and very easily theme and style it. So the stack supports views, like also it has layout builder support, web form, multilingual, just works as it works. There's nothing really special to do. So quite some things. So if you're interested, just check it out at lupusdecoupledorg. Maybe you can open that quickly. It just has all the information and a bunch of documentation to get you started. So in the end, it's just the Drupal module and the front end. Yeah, but once you have that up and running, you also need to deploy your application. Like as mentioned, there is, of course, with server rendering, you need a server, so you can just do a Node.js runtime. You can do container deployments with Docker. Or as mentioned, Nitro also has the serverless support. You can go serverless with solutions like Vercel, Netlify, Cloudflare. There's also Nuxt Hub, which is an interesting solution provided and running by the Nuxt team, which basically is a wrapper around Cloudflare, so makes it more easy to get started and use all the Cloudflare tools. You can also use AWS Lambda, Azure Functions, or like with static generation, you can just use your own web server, Apache Nginx to serve the static files, or of course also go with the vendors like Netlify, Vercel, also Cloudflare Pages is nice, which helps actually with the build part. So you have like a webhook that you can trigger to build and statically generate your application whenever it's needed. What's then convenient, like when you have like an editor making changes, you can ping the webhook, so it's then at least triggered automatically. Yeah. For that deployment, Nuxt has deployment presets, so basically you can just configure then your type of deployment, and that then usually just works with that out of the box. But there are also like a lot of available deployment presets for the different deployment solutions, so you can check that out at nuxt.com/deploy. For performance optimizations, I mentioned already, there's also the possibility to lazy load heavy components. So you can do that by just having the lazy prefix when you use a component. So then when it's used conditionally, then Nuxt will make sure if it's not used, it's not loaded, and only if it gets used, then it gets loaded. Then there's also this hydration process I mentioned before. So this is also something which has a lot of room for optimization, because you can imagine like replaying the whole JavaScript application in the browser. Depending of the application, it can become resource heavy also. So then it makes sense to, for example, only hydrate things that are visible immediately, and then like the other things, hydrate them when they become visible. So that now Nuxt has built in as a feature, like we are recently in the Nuxt 3.16, this was introduced, and you can just add this directive, hydrate on visible, and it will just do it like this. Or also, like for the mobile menu, it might be convenient to only hydrate it when it's actually used, so you can hydrate it based upon a media query, also quite handy. For debugging, also Nuxt comes with a built-in solution, the Nuxt developer tools. You just need to enable it like this in the configuration, and then it will actually appear in the browser of Nuxt as a small icon, and once you click on it, it will load the whole developer tools, and it has lots of really handy things to introspect your Nuxt application. Most notable, it has a component inspector. You can inspect all your Vue components and the state of them, change the data. You can inspect the payload, make performance analysis, lots of things, so quite handy. For testing, there are the Nuxt test utils provided, which basically are helpers around unit testing, but also end-to-end testing. So for unit testing, by default, it makes use of vtest, and it has helpers for, in particular, testing components. For end-to-end testing, it has Playwright, but I think you can also use Cypress. And as mentioned, it has just have a bunch of very handy helpers. So when you would like to use that, it's best to just take a look at the documentation. It has a couple of useful examples, but maybe to get an idea, here's like one example, unit test for testing a component. Basically, here it makes use of a helper, the mount suspended, and you can just say, okay, I want to mount the test route here, and then basically do some expectations on the returned HTML. So it's also quite simple to just test some component to work correctly. Yeah, finally, Vue and Nuxt are also true open source projects like Drupal. It's really community-driven development. It's not like there's one big commercial entity owning the project. No, they are both like independent. And also they value accessibility and progressive enhancements. So I think actually they are quite good fit for Drupal, and I like the combination actually. Yeah. So if you're interested, I also added a couple of resources for you. So like most notable, there's Nuxt.com, as you might already know it. It has great documentations. It is the index of the modules is there. It has a bunch of examples which you can just launch in StackBlitz. It has the API reference. The code is hosted on GitHub, so you can go to GitHub to see all the code, the issues, and the releases. Then for Vue.js, there's Vue.js.org, which also, of course, contains documentation. What might be worth a try is learn.nuxt.com, which is an interactive tutorial, which is not fully finished yet, but it's also quite handy to get started with it. And if you prefer video courses, I can recommend masteringnuxt.com, which is also it's a paid video course, but also maintained by the one company behind Nuxt, like Nuxt Labs, which pays a lot of the Nuxt developers. So it's indirectly also then helps the Nuxt project if you go for the video subscriptions. Yeah, that's my presentation. Thank you for the attention. Any questions? Yep.
What type of apps have you created with, or do you suggest creating with Nuxt and Drupal, and not only Drupal or only Nuxt?
Yeah. So the question is, what kind of apps would you suggest building with Nuxt and Drupal, and not only Nuxt or only Drupal? Both. Yeah. I guess it really depends on how you see the things, and there are lots of opinions out there. But my point of view, it's actually, since it's a versatile framework, we like to use it for every kind of project, also for content-heavy sites. For content-heavy sites, the hydration is something you don't necessarily need or want, but you can optimize it away. And also Nuxt is built in an easy way, so you can, it's basically easy to have things optionally and not load it in your application, and it's still quite performant. So I would actually recommend using it for any kind of Drupal website, content website, or my application-centric websites. I guess it makes in particular more sense if it's an application than a content-heavy website. But also e-commerce websites, I think it can do really well in all of those use cases. Also, there are modules for progressive web applications, that kind of thing. So if you want to have a more app-like experience, that's also something you can do nicely. So I guess it's also a matter of preference, but since like the front end is just very easy to work with, and also like with the stack we built, it's easy to connect it with Drupal. So I don't think there's like a big hurdle you have to get over to get started using it. So I can recommend it for any kind of things. Yeah.
Side question. I tried Drupal with Next a couple of times, and there are some known issues when it comes to connecting Drupal to any front-end or, for instance, the hashtags, redirects. In theory it works, but when it comes to rebuilding it, and all that, do you have any experience on that, and also on unpublishing and workflows in general? When you unpublish a page, admins to access it, all that. Do you have all that issues as well? Or?
So to quickly repeat the question. So the question is about when working with Next and Drupal, or generally with modern frontends and Drupal like this, I guess the issues are often like around redirects, cache tags, and also admin experience, unpublished content that you get. Basically, you have issues with that it's not working. And yeah, I've experienced with that, and I would say this is why we built our stack and the stack this way, because we solved it once there. In the way we still shifting all this work back to Drupal. So in our stack, like basically redirects, it's still handled by Drupal. It's a redirect API response, which then is just applied by Nuxt. So the redirects are still controlled by Drupal, or like authentication, the cookies is forwarded to Drupal, so Drupal still does authentication session handling, and that way we can just also do like a login and have like the login working on the website. That way we have unpublished content on the website as usual. So that kind of things we just have then working with the environment. What else? Cache tags. Since we, like with Lupus decoupled Drupal, it's a page-oriented API, so it's still Drupal taking care of the page response, so it also takes care of cache tags, so it still works the same way it works as it works with the regular Drupal cache tag system. So we are just using it as with traditional Drupal. Yeah.
Sorry, a follow-up question. But when you say Drupal cache tags, you mean, let's say we have we update a news page, and we have a /news page and it's listing there. So the /news page also needs to be revalidated, right?
Yes. So basically what we are doing is we are passing through the cache tags. So in the front end we have the same cache tags as in the backend, and then we just send the purge request to both zones, the backend and the front end zone, or we actually only cache in the front end and just send it to the front end zone, because this is where all the traffic goes. That works quite nicely. So the Nuxt.js Drupal Elements connector module that we built, that we basically connects Nuxt to the API provided them by Drupal. It has some configuration options on which headers to forward. And by default, it takes care of forwarding the cookie headers, so you can just log in and have the cookie. But I guess like CDN tag, or like if you have a special header for that, you can just add it to the list of forwarded headers, and then it will be also in the front end, and that way you can purge immediately. So then we don't do like caching in the front end. We move the cache into the CDN, like have it in the CDN, but like you could also theoretically do like embrace cache within Nuxt, have like, I don't know, Redis cache for your pages and do it in there. So we don't do that, because that you would have to integrate with cache tags. But once you do it on a CDN layer, it works quite nice. Yeah, I think we are over time anyway, then thanks a lot.
Everyone. So let me get started here. Hi everyone, thanks for coming to this talk on the power of Drupal plugins. Hopefully this is a talk that will help you learn something new and help advance your development skills, or at least give you a kind of mental framework to think about how to use the Drupal plugin system for some of your upcoming projects. This is kind of the agenda. I just will very briefly tell you about myself, focus on some of the basic concepts in the system. So the basics, and then we'll talk about the plugin managers and plugin IDs, plugin discovery, plugin derivatives, how config entities interact with plugins. And then the last sections will be kind of starting places where you might write your first plugins, basically starting places for you to write code. And then finally, kind of just touch on an advanced topic of defining your own plugin types. So that's sort of the overall agenda. About me, hopefully you're here because you think I have something to say. I've been doing Drupal stuff for a very long time at this point. I am one of the organizers of Drupal Camp New Jersey, and if it was not so cold in here, I'd be showing my t-shirt from the event. But I just want to say I know that these events take a lot of effort to put on, so I want to say thank you personally, and I hope that you all say thank you to the organizers of this event, because I'm sure they put a lot of time and effort into making it as great as it is. So the other thing I'll mention, I'm working for a company newly created through a merger called SciSure. So this is a combination of eLab Next, which is based in the Netherlands, and SciShield. And SciShield, we have a web application that's based on Drupal, used for laboratory safety and compliance. We help researchers stay safe, manage their chemical inventories, and report about those things. And eLab Next has electronic laboratory notebooks where they help researchers keep track of their experiments. So we're trying to bring these things together and basically make the world of science more efficient and more accurate and more traceable by digitizing it. Okay, so let's jump right in. If you have a brief question during this, of course, you could stop me if something's really unclear, but we should, I think, have 5 or 10 minutes at the end for questions. So if you have a longer question, maybe wait for that. So just to dive in, so plugins. Plugins, basically some reusable code. We encapsulate some particular function we want to reuse more than once, and we have to have a specific interface. For a given type of plugin has a specific interface. And so plugins of the same type, they have the same interface, and then be thought of as different ways to satisfy the same need. So, an example would be the views module. You have different rows. You can maybe pick a different format for your different rows. The row formatter is a plugin, right? So you can see, okay, the need is formatting the row. I pick the plugin, and I get a different format. You could also have something more abstract. Let's say you wanted to get stock market quotes. You have different APIs. You want to integrate with different Drupal sites with stock market APIs. So you have some plugins that you might create. They have a common interface where you ask for the latest stock market quote. And those different plugins know how to interact with different APIs and give you a consistent result back. Right, so it's the same need, but different result, different data, maybe from a different backend using completely different code. So plugins are provided by modules, if that wasn't obvious, and they kind of extend Drupal. And as I mentioned, they're often used when the user or developer wants to be able to pick from different solutions. Again, you pick a different row, you pick a different API to talk to. And these fall into an object-oriented design pattern, of course, called the plugin pattern. So if you want to learn more about the sort of concept of plugins, you could search the web for object-oriented design and plugin pattern. Okay, so one of the other things that's great about plugins, and so this system has been in Drupal since Drupal 8, and there were sort of versions of it in earlier versions of Drupal, but not used widely in core. So if you remember Drupal 7 and before, we had things like hook block. And so we find all the blocks provided by all the modules. That wasn't so flexible. In particular, you could only put one block in one location throughout your entire site. And plugins are flexible in a couple of ways. In particular, one module is very easy to provide many plugins of the same type from one module. And then one plugin can be reused potentially. And you've probably experienced this. If you've built a Drupal site, you can take the same block in a Drupal site now, and you can place it as many times as you want. You can place it in different regions, on different pages, with different visibility conditions, but it's the same plugin underlying that, the same PHP code. All right, and that's not something you could do with hook block in Drupal 7. There's also a lot of flexibility. If you really needed to alter this system for some reason, you need to tweak, substitute, change what's being done by Drupal core, by a contrib module. You can even alter, for example, the class being used by a particular plugin, because you can take advantage of the fact that there's a specific interface, again, that these plugins use. So as long as you substitute something with the same interface, the code that's calling it won't know the difference. Okay. So let's just dive in, look at sort of some code, orient you, and I'll just comment. So the code samples are basically all from Drupal 11 core. Some of them I've edited a little bit just so they fit on the slide or they're clearer, but not major edits. So if you go look in the code base, you should be able to find these. And the first thing I want to point out, you can see at the top left is this field storage config. So this is an exported configuration entity, field storage config, and it has a type key. Turns out this type key, the value there is a plugin ID. And we'll talk more about plugin IDs, but just to kind of start to orient you about how this all fits together. And you see to the block to the right, so that ID for this field type plugin is the string image. And that's really all this does, is look up the string image as the value. Hey, go find me the field type where the plugin ID is the string image. Okay, great. Now this field type has some arguments being passed into that attribute. And you'll see one of the arguments being passed in is a list of constraints. It turns out those constraints, the names of those constraints are also plugin IDs. And so you see over here at the bottom, we reference this constraint. Its plugin ID is file validation, which happens to be in camel case in this case. And so the plugin IDs are just strings. They can be really anything you want. They follow some conventions, as we'll talk about later. But for the most part, you can even see these things. So one case it's just normal or snake case, and another case camel case. Anything can really be, any string can be a plugin ID. So keep that in mind also. So that's it. So part of the point of this is you'll have probably already seen references to plugins and plugin IDs throughout Drupal code if you've opened things up. But in these examples, I think it's not really obvious, right, at first glance that we're talking about plugins. Like, how do I know that the name of a constraint is a plugin? You don't until you've gone and looked for it. So in some cases, it'll be more obvious. The key will say plugin or plugin ID. But in other cases, you just have to start digging in a little bit, and you'll have that aha that, oh, this thing that's making this work, this type of field, this type of constraint is a plugin. So these are really all throughout Drupal core and important for that reason. Okay. So let's talk about the plugin manager. So plugin manager, every type of plugin has to have a manager, or at least that's the convention. That's how it works typically throughout Drupal core. And you register that as a service. And that service is then used to instantiate desired plugin instances. And I'll show you what that looks like in code. I've already mentioned plugin IDs, right? So every plugin has an ID. And that might be in its definition. We'll get back to what a definition is. But as you saw in that previous example, it's basically just a string. Could also be generated as a derivative, confusing topic. For a given plugin ID, another way to kind of wrap your head around this, for given plugin ID, those are always going to be the same class. So there's kind of a one-to-one mapping between, hey, I want a plugin of this ID, and the instance I get back, it's always the same class. That never varies. When we talk about a plugin instance, that's a little bit more specific. That's a combination of the plugin ID and some configuration. So you remember I talked about blocks. You can place the block multiple times. You can put them on different pages with different visibilities. So those are different instances of the same block plugin. And that configuration potentially comes from a config entity. That is another confusing topic, which we will come back to and talk more about later in the talk. Okay, so just to give you an idea what this looks like, this is the plugin manager. I mentioned all these plugin types have one. They implement this factory interface. It's very straightforward. In the factory interface, it has this method, create instance. And you see that I need to give it a plugin ID, and I could give it some configuration, and that will give me back the plugin instance I care about. And so an example, and I'm going to come back to this example a few times, is the queue worker plugins. And these are plugins that I use all the time in the work that I do. Very handy. So if you need to basically process some data behind the scenes, you've already set up cron for your Drupal site, so cron is running regularly. You're already in a good position to take advantage of the system and process some data every time the cron runs. Then that's what these queue worker plugins do, is process data from a queue every time cron runs, or can process every time cron runs. Okay, and the code that I'm looking at here is taken from Drupal core's cron service. This is in a file called cron.php, so you can go and look at that. And you'll see that in this cron service, it has the queue worker manager. So that's a plugin manager for queue workers. And the line that's highlighted at the bottom, you can see, is just the method invocation of what I showed you in that last slide of the interface of creating an instance for a queue worker. And you'll see, we'll talk more about definitions. Again, the way we're getting here is we're asking the queue worker manager for all the definitions. The keys in the definitions are the plugin IDs, which are also exactly the same as the names of the queues being processed. That's just, if you work with the system, you'll need to remember that. The queue name and the plugin ID are identical. So it's sort of easy, also a little bit limiting. But let's focus on easy. So you see there, I just used the queue name as the plugin ID. I asked for the worker matching this queue, and now I'm going to process the data. So that's actually pretty easy. And then, as I said, the plugins all have to have a specific interface. So we have a queue worker interface, and that's, again, a very simple interface. One method, process item, and I pass in the data that was on the queue. So what does that look like? Here's an example later on in that cron service where I'm actually doing the work. And you'll see that this is a loop. So it's a while loop, and I'm looping for a certain amount of time, and as long as I get something off of the queue, essentially I'm just calling process item on each thing. Very simple. And if everything goes well, it means I successfully processed. There's no exception. Basically, if something went wrong, I need an exception. If everything went well, that's great. It means I succeeded, and I delete the item off the queue, and that's how you remove items from the queue. So you think of it just taking the top item off the queue here, passing it to the queue worker, and then getting rid of it because it was done. So again, this is something I find extremely useful. You may also. So something hopefully you'll take back with you from this is, hey, if I'm not already doing it, I could write a queue worker plugin. Okay, and so now the next piece fitting this together. So we had the general idea of plugins. We had the plugin manager looking for a plugin based on its ID. But now we need to know, how does the plugin manager find all the plugins that are available? And that process is called discovery. And the simple version of discovery, which is probably the one you'll use and is most common, so I'm going to focus on that, is that we find all the PHP classes that have the right attribute in the right namespace with the right interface. So you need all three of those things to match normally, and any class that matches all three of those conditions will be found by the plugin manager as an available plugin for this type. So it's actually, in a way, very simple, but again, you have to get all these things right. Yeah, I've mentioned the plugin ID a bunch of times. Of course, that is required. You have to have an ID. And then there's arguments to attribute that become part of the plugin definition, something I mentioned before. And this definition is a fixed array of values used to create the plugin. So it's the same, every plugin with the same ID gets the same definition. So there's no variation. One thing also to keep in the back of your mind is the discovery is usually cached. So it's in the cache, in the database maybe. So if you start to write a new plugin and you're like, why is that not showing up? Right, you probably need to do a cache rebuild, trigger this process of discovery to happen again so that your new plugin can be found. Okay. And aside, in case people aren't familiar with PHP attributes, I feel like I'm still wrapping my head around them. So this is a feature since PHP 8. They use this kind of format of a hash mark and square brackets around the name of an attribute. And what's kind of weird is that the name of the attribute is generally also the name of a class. And so the class can do more than obviously just exist. It can take arguments, it can have methods, so keep in mind the attribute is also a class, and then arguments can be passed into attributes. And Drupal, as we've seen before, basically uses named argument syntax. So you guys may have seen this in more recent versions of PHP. Instead of just putting the arguments to something in an order, you can specify the name of the argument when you pass it in to an invocation. So that's basically what's happening here, right? And that makes it very clear that ID is the first argument and label is the second. But the nice thing about named arguments, right, is I could reorder these; it would still work fine. Okay, and getting back to this idea of a plugin definition and why that's useful. Again, these arguments to attribute basically become the definition, or are maybe enhanced with some other things from the queue worker manager. So this is an example of a queue worker plugin. The process is media thumbnails. And you'll see some interesting things in the attribute arguments. In particular, you'll see this line I highlighted about the cron. And this is an important argument you want to pass in. If you want your queue worker to process things on cron, you need to specify this argument and say, yes, process on cron. And it wants to know how much time I want. I want 60 seconds. So every time cron runs, this particular queue worker will process data for up to 60 seconds. And that's what that means. Okay, and then you may not have noticed it before, but just getting back to this code we looked at before, this plugin definition can be used internally to the plugin, can also be used externally, and it's used externally here in the cron service. And you'll see the line I highlighted. We're checking the plugin definition to say how much time did you ask for on cron. We're getting this as a time for which we claim the queue items and an amount of time that we're going to loop over the queue items using the same time. And so that's why it's important that you specify something reasonable in there that you're going to use and will be enough to process your data off. Okay. So I mentioned this a couple times already, but mention it once again because I personally was repeatedly confused about this when first learning about plugins, is the difference between the definition and configuration, because they seem very similar. But what I'll just reiterate is, you remember the configuration was optional. I didn't have to provide any configuration at all to create a plugin instance. In contrast, the plugin definition is just part of the plugin. It's part of that annotation, or sorry, attribute. So you always get the plugin definition. The plugin definition is always the same for every plugin for the same ID. But the configuration could be variable. So keep in mind, definition, yes, that's always the same. Configuration is different, could be coming in from somewhere else in the system. Okay, so stepping back about discovery, I said, the most common version is using this attribute namespace and interface discovery. There are other ways to discover plugins that Drupal core uses. In particular, there's some that use YAML files for discovery, and I'll just touch on that briefly. You could also see some based on hooks. You could see really any mechanism you want to define in your plugin manager can be used. But because Drupal core very easily supports this attribute namespace interface setup, that's what most plugins you see will use. However, also if you look, you'll see that there's still backwards compatibility support for using annotations. So annotations look kind of like the attributes, but they're actually just code comments that are parsed separately. And the reason those are still supported is that PHP, only until after PHP 8 had attributes, and before PHP 8 didn't have anything, so we had to basically make one up, which was annotations. The other thing to know about discovery is it's the process through which derivatives are generated. And we'll come back to that very shortly and talk about derivatives. First, I just want to kind of give you a little view into a completely different way to discover plugins. Might meet certain use cases, and this is YAML file discovery. And these are local actions. So if you've written a module and you wanted to put just a link on a page, right, that's a local action. It kind of tends to show up as a button. It might be like go here or create a new entity, things like that. Those are local actions versus the local tasks, which are the tabs. And so the local actions here in the YAML file, that top level key, that's your plugin ID. And then the rest of the data is basically the plugin definition. And you'll see that one of these two specifies a class to use. But if you look through Drupal core, you'd find that most of these do not specify a class. And this YAML file discovery strategy is sort of used for these things like local actions and local tasks, where almost all of them use the same class. And so there's only a few percent that need something different and override the class. But the ability to override the class, the ability to do something specific is why this is powerful. This is why these are plugins. So that you as a developer can say, oh, in this special case, I need extra query strings, I need extra checking, access checking, I need something different than the standard, and I want to use it for this specific local action, which is different from the default. So in this case, for this local action, this menu link add, the special thing that it's doing is just taking, adding an extra query string to the link, something very simple. But you might actually find this useful in some cases. So it's basically saying, when starting from this page, if someone clicks this link, creates a menu link, I want them to automatically be redirected back to where they started. Most local actions that don't actually want this to happen, they don't actually want you to come back. This one wants you to come back, and so it overrides the class with a very small enhancement to this one method. So again, something to think about if you have these kind of problems, you're like, why can't I make this happen? This is the kind of strategy you can use, your own plugin class, to make these enhancements happen. I mentioned attributes versus annotations. And so you can see basically Drupal 10 or 11 versus Drupal 8 or 9. This plugin was the same plugin, but in earlier versions, it had to use attributes or annotations because attributes did not exist yet. And you see that the data in the annotation, even though it's from a PHP language standpoint just a comment, there's actually data in there. Drupal would parse that data out and still does for backwards compatibility, and send the same definition to the plugin as it does now using the attribute. So if you see something like this where you see it's formatted like a comment, just keep in mind essentially that's just can be mapped, and in the future will have to be mapped into an attribute instead of being an annotation. Okay, great. All right, so one of the topics that certainly I've found confusing over the years is derivatives. So a plugin definition, as I said, of course has to have an ID, but it can also have a value called a driver. And this basically names a class that is going to generate many different final plugin IDs based on the ID that's in this one and using that ID as the base ID. So you see here the ID is entity. That's basically going to be the base. And then this entity driver class is going to go ahead and create a bunch of derivatives, more plugins based on this REST resource plugin that we have here. So basically going to generate multiple actual plugins using possibly the same class, the same plugin class, but they'll each one have a different ID and be used maybe for a different purpose. So if you want to dig on a little more on that, of course, there's an interface for these drivers if you want to write one, but basically they give you back a list of all the plugins based on the base plugin you passed in. The final ID, and we'll see this more in further examples, is just a base ID, a colon, and the variant. It can be other things, but this is 95, 99% of the time it's going to look like this. And there are a bunch of use cases for this, but the most common by far use case is that I want to plug in derivative for every entity type, or maybe I want to plug in derivative for every bundle of every entity type in Drupal. And you've probably already experienced this, but you didn't realize it. So if you use the field UI, right, you go to configure fields, add fields, manage fields for a bundle of an entity. There's a tab at the top, right, that says manage fields. Where do you think that tab comes from? That is actually a derivative local task plugin, right, that was derived so that there is a tab like that present for every bundle of every entity in Drupal. So that's an example of use case. Like otherwise, like how would you have those tabs present? Other common examples, if you've ever done migrations. So you've seen maybe this is migration destination. Looks like default node, or maybe entity node, if I got that wrong. Again, so it's generating a destination for every entity type. Entity reference selection. So if there are entity reference selection plugins. They work with entity reference fields and basically tell the entity reference field how to find the things that can be referenced. And again, these are generated for every entity type. And this one is a little interesting because you can override it if you implement one of these in advance. And particularly the node one is a little bit different from the others. And if you went and looked at default node, it exists in the node module separately and behaves a little bit different from the default comment one, which is just the standard code. And finally, one that we'll come back to again, and is a pretty different use case, is in views. So views basically just has one block plugin. And then for every view, if you have a block display, this driver creates a block plugin derivative for each block display in every view in your system. So views basically just has one plugin for blocks, but then generates all the derivatives corresponding to all the block displays in all the views. Right, so we're very kind of compact with our code. We just have it once, and then we reuse it again and again for all the different blocks and views. Okay, So that was derivatives. Hopefully you at least have some idea. The other thing I found very confusing, especially when I was first learning about Drupal plugins, was about config entities. Because I thought, okay, now I understand it. I'm going to grab the manager for this plugin, and I would say, you know, create instance, and I'm going to get the plugin instance, and I do something with it. And then it was like, no, but you have to have the config entity. And I was like, no, I just got lost. I thought I needed the manager to create the plugin and do the thing. So, okay, let's back up a little, and remember I talked about the factory interface for the plugin manager. The factory interface, again, we call create instance, we need a plugin ID, and optionally some configuration. Right, in that plugin, we get a specific plugin instance with a combination of the ID and that configuration. It turns out in the majority of the cases, maybe almost all the cases in Drupal core, if there's data being passed in there, that's actually coming from a config entity. So there's a config entity that's stored, that basically stores the variation among these different plugin instances. And so it turns out, you know, I showed this at the beginning, but I didn't tell you, right, that one of the most common places you see plugins referenced is in these YAML exports of config entities, or in the config entities, but usually you're looking at the YAML exports. So that field storage config I showed you at the beginning, right, referencing the field type as a plugin. Views config entities, of course, reference many different plugins, like for the rows, for different things that need to be configured in the view. I mentioned migrate, so migrate plus, and of course blocks as our common example. So even sort of more, right, so this gets even more confusing because now we have these config entities. Config entities don't necessarily even just have one plugin involved. They might have a whole collection of plugin involved. And especially when you think of views, right, I need to know about the plugins for the rows. I need to think about the plugins for the filters. I need to think about all different kinds of plugins that view is going to use. So each of those different plugins is configured using a subset of the data in that configuration entity. In core, you'll see that there's a common pattern that even for plugins that have only one plugin or one main plugin, there's still a collection, an object that's called a collection. That way, the code that interacts with these config entities doesn't have to care whether there's one or many. It could just call give me the collection. And one of the take-home lessons for today is if you start interacting with plugins where their configuration is managed through configuration entities, it's much, much easier to load the configuration entity and then ask the configuration entity to please give you the configured plugin than to go the other way around. If you try to just get the ID and then get the plugin manager and try to find the configuration from the entity, you're going to suffer a lot, but the configuration entity classes are written to know how to put this together and give you the plugin with the right data. So that's one of the important take-home lessons if you start developing this stuff. So just, as I said, you'll see these in YAML exports. In this case, for blocks, the plugin ID is labeled plugin. That's easy. You see below that, what's called settings here is actually the configuration that's passed into the block. And an example to look at particularly is label display. And then I said you could get the plugin from the entity. And so that's at the bottom here, right? We're just asking the entity type manager for the storage for block config entities and loading this Olivero powered block, and then asking that config entity to get plugin. So block config entities have a method, get plugin. Several other config entities have a similar method or the same. I'll get you the main plugin. And then you could do whatever you wanted with it. It's already configured for this specific block. And then let's just look at the code for the actual block plugin. So this is kind of a little bit of jumping ahead if you wanted to think about writing your own plugins. One of the great places to start is writing a block plugin. And you see, of course, the ID matches what we saw in that export. You see it has a set of default configuration. You don't have to do that, but the label display is a set of default configuration which could be overridden by the configuration coming from the configuration entity. And then the main thing, if you're writing a block that you have to worry about, is writing this build method. And the build method returns a render array. So pretty straightforward. I want to write a block plugin. The main thing I have to do is write this build method and figure out what render array I want and what, therefore, will be rendered on my Drupal page. Of course, this is made easier for the case of blocks and a lot of other core plugins. You'll see that there's a base class. So there's a block base class. This is extending, right? And so for many of these plugins, they have a base class in core, and you can extend those, and maybe you save a bunch of boilerplate code or things you don't care about. Maybe there's default configuration, you don't need anything, so that's just an empty method in the base class, and you don't have to implement it in your specific class. So again, come back to something like this. This is a nice simple example. Might be a good starting point for you. If you want to write a custom block, you basically copy this code and rename the class and the ID. Okay, this is a more complicated example of YAML export of a block config entity for a view, right? So this is a views block from the Umami theme. And you'll see in this case, the plugin ID is something more complicated, right? And this is the derivative ID I talked about earlier. So the first part called views block, that's if you looked in the code and you looked for the corresponding class, views block class, it would just have that first part as the ID. But then we got the specific variant appended after the colon, right? So that's names essentially the specific view and its display. And so those two things mashed together make the plugin ID, and that's the final actual plugin ID that you have to ask the plugin manager to give you an instance of. You'll see again, there's a bunch of settings that are passed into the configuration, and then this views block also has a second section and actually references another plugin, which is also a derivative for visibility, right? And so you see the entity bundle :node is a visibility plugin here, and we're going to basically tell that plugin that we only care about article type nodes to show this particular block. So I told you blocks have a method to give you the main plugin, but they actually have a collection that has this extra visibility plugin also. Okay. So starting places for you. We've already talked about a couple of these. So processing a queue on cron, I think great example. Talk about it a little bit more, but we already saw a bunch about that in section 2. Defining a simple block, I just told you about on the last slide in section 5. And the last thing I think might be a great starting point for you, if you want to write a plugin, do something useful for one of your projects, is implementing a custom REST endpoint. So in order to do that, you're going to want to turn on the REST module in Drupal core. You probably want to get the REST UI contrib module. And the reason for that is that in order for your REST endpoint to actually work, you need to have a config entity that essentially turns on the plugin. This system is a little funny. It's mostly kind of a one-to-one of the config entity to the plugin because obviously the path has to be unique. But REST UI just is a shortcut to creating those. And then I'm going to show you an example of a REST module, REST resource plugin. So this dblog example I grabbed because it's simple and from core. Does have some flaws, including lack of proper dependency injection. So hopefully you will notice that and shudder. And we will talk about how to do proper dependency injection afterwards. But here, right, so we have this dblog plugin. So that's the plugin ID, the class dblog resource. There's a base class, right, in this REST module provides you a resource-based class, so it saves you a lot of work. This is a very simple piece of code. You'll see that in the annotation, we're passing in this argument to tell the REST module basically what path should this REST endpoint respond to. And you can see the dblog/ID is the canonical basically main path that this endpoint should respond to. So essentially that's going to get processed into a route automatically. And in addition, I want to respond to a GET request. And in order to respond to a GET request, I need to implement in this plugin the GET method. So a very simple mapping there, right? GET request will map in the route to the GET method on the plugin. And that's how it goes together. And you see this GET method is very simple. It's taking an ID from the path, looking up in the database for a watchdog ID that matches. If it finds that, get back that array of data, wrap it in a resource response, and return that. And something else you'll notice here that's very, very nice as a developer is I don't have to think about how that data is going to be rendered to the browser or to the whatever is calling the API. This resource response just takes the data, and then the REST system handles the rest of it. The REST plugin system handles rendering that back depending on the requested format. So what's this basically can be turned on using the REST UI module, as I mentioned. So this is what REST UI looks like. If you turn on, it has one config page, very long. You go to the bottom, find this watchdog database log, hit enable. I turned on all the options for all the formats and everything. There are only 2 in core. I exported the created configuration entity. This is what it looks like. So it has a UUID because it's a real specific entity I created. You'll see it's referencing that dblog plugin ID, matches the class we were looking at, and it supports JSON and XML formats. Great. So I've now just like solved all kinds of use cases, just writing this very small amount of code, right, to look something up in the database and return an array of data. I didn't have to think about anything, but if I wanted to, I could go now and make these requests, ask for format JSON, I get it back as JSON, ask for format XML, I get it back as XML. Again, this is a great example of something that you, as you have a need to make a REST endpoint. Instead of jumping through a lot of hoops, you could just implement one of these plugins. It'll save you a lot of time and effort. Okay, I mentioned dependency injection. So that's basically when you get things from the Drupal service container, inject them into the constructor of your class instead of doing what that dblog1 was, which was calling that global Drupal object directly. So dependency injection is great for a lot of reasons, including making your code more testable. So the thing I've highlighted on the screen and what you should remember when you're thinking about writing plugins is that you want to use this container factory plugin interface if you need any dependencies for your plugin. So you want the database, you want the entity type manager, you want something else, you should use this container factory plugin interface, and that will make your life a lot easier just to get that in sort of a correct, let's say, correct way. And this interface is very simple. Basically, you implement this method that says create, and the plugin manager will call this static create method and pass in the service container in order to get the instance instead of directly calling new on your class. That's kind of all the magic there is. And then how does that work? So here's the queue worker. We've talked about it a couple times already, right? And the line I've highlighted is where it's implementing this interface. It's creating a new instance of this class. That's what new static means. But it's adding an extra argument there, which is it's pulling from the container the entity type manager. And then what happens with that is we look at the constructor of that class, right? And it's a normal constructor for a plugin only has the configuration, the plugin ID, and the plugin definition. But we've added an extra argument here, the entity type manager, which we're going to use. And so we have to call the parent method with the standard arguments, and then we're just storing our entity type manager for use when this queue worker is invoked. And to show you what that looks like, again, just put it all together. And again, this is the kind of thing you should be able to write. Look at how little code this is for great convenience, right? Basically, I can put things on a queue. On Drupal cron, the things are going to be pulled off the queue, and then they're going to be passed into this queue worker plugin and processed. And the processing doesn't have to be anything complicated here, right? It's just something I want to do in the background. I didn't want to do this at the same time the user saved the media item. I just want to do it later. I want to get the thumbnail sometime later. I want to update the thumbnail. Okay, so the code here, you see we're using that injected entity type manager to get the media entity storage, loading the media entity. So basically the queue item, all the queue item had was the entity ID for the media item. It was very simple. You didn't need much. Asking that entity to update its thumbnail and then resaving it. So this is a great example of a pretty simple queue worker, but again, this means that if you're building some kind of system and you're like, oh, I need to fetch this data when the user hits save, maybe don't do that in real time. Put it on a queue, let it get processed off on cron, so it'll be there later and it doesn't impact the user's experience if for some reason this process is slow. Okay. Last topic is defining your own type of plugin. And this is definitely a more advanced use case. I would say if you're writing your own contributed module, or you have a complex custom module, and let's say you're deploying a web application for multiple customers using the same code base, and you want to like pick different solutions for a particular problem on different sites, you might do this kind of thing. And we talked a lot of examples already for plugins, but again, why might you come up with something custom? You need a specific way to store or access secrets or credentials. Maybe this is specific to your hosting platform, maybe it's specific to your company. Maybe a common way to access different APIs. Remember I mentioned like stock market API. Oh, maybe I want weather API. Different customers want different weather from different sources, or they want to translate some text using different services. Or for example, I told you we do laboratory safety, so we need to look up chemical safety data sheets. And we have different providers. All the providers, of course, need the chemical name, maybe the CAS number, but the queries, the way you format those, the way you retrieve the data, the way the data is formatted is all different for those providers, but I can write a plugin with a common interface, and all I need to do is, hey, plugin, go get me this safety data sheet for this chemical name and this CAS number, and I don't have to worry about all the details, right? And I can just, for a given site, I can configure which of those sources of that data I want to use. And finally, again, I mentioned like rendering. You have some complex use case that's not views. You could write plugins to, toggle the way you render data in different rows. Just kind of trying to throw out some ideas, get you thinking, hey, in my projects, is there something where I might want to define my own plugin type? And so this is sort of an outline of what's needed. So you need an attribute to attach to your class. You need a namespace, you need an interface, and then you need a plugin manager. And then you need a service definition for the plugin manager. All right, so these are all things we mentioned, but you're gonna have to write these basically from scratch, but there's a lot of code already existing that you can extend. There's not a lot to write, actually. And then, of course, you want to implement at least one example of the plugin, at least in a test, to make sure that your whole system works. So just to kind of show you what that ends up looking like in the plugin manager, this KeyWorker manager calls its parent default plugin manager, and in calling that parent, it has to tell it a few things, and I'm focusing kind of on the three things we talked about multiple times, right, is the namespace, the interface, and the attribute. So you see it has to tell the default plugin manager which subdirectory to look in. Of course, as you know, with PSR4, the subdirectory and the namespace basically map one-to-one, right? So this telling the subdirectory is the same as determining the namespace, what interface am I looking for, and what attribute is this class going to be associated with. So that's kind of, if you wanted to write your own manager, you could do as little as this, essentially, and have a working plugin manager. I mentioned caching. You see that we have a helper method to set cache backend with a cache key. And then we have alter info as a helper method, and this defines an alter hook. Remember, very back at the beginning, I told you that if you needed to, basically all the plugin types have an alter mechanism and an alter hook where you can go through and you can tweak stuff. If for some reason, you need to change what Drupal core is doing or some module is doing, there's often an alter hook that will let you change the class or change something about the plugin definition. So where that comes from is here. So here we're defining qinfo alter hook. You'd have to look up the full name, but plugin info alter, basically. Okay, so let's wrap up. Well, hopefully we'll have a few minutes for questions. So remember, plugins of a type have a specific interface, and a plugin instance is a combination of plugin ID and a set of configuration. Plugins are provided by modules, and typically, as we keep saying, discovered based on the namespace, the interface, and the PHP attribute on the class. And most configurations that need configuration are going to get it from a configuration entity. So if you need one of those plugins, load the entity up and get the plugin already configured out of the entity. That will save you a lot of hassle. Okay, the session slides should already be posted, so you can go to these links. There's actually pretty extensive documentation on Drupal.org. Also, some other posts. Again, the Drupal plugin system hasn't changed that much from Drupal 8 till now, other than substituting attributes for annotations. So some of these posts may be older, but for the most part, still relevant. I said this is all already posted in the session slides. And that's it. Thank you for attending, and I would be very pleased to take your questions. Let's try this, so everyone can hear.
So one first, is everything moved to annotations to PHP in core?
To attributes. Yeah, pretty, most of the plugins in core, if not all, are using an attribute
And they will
now.
be deprecated at one point, the annotation.
Yeah, so to be deprecated, I mean, so at this point, if you have a customer contributed module, the annotations will still be found, but so you don't have to have converted yet, but yeah, I don't know, maybe Drupal 12 will be fully deprecated.
13, who knows?
Right.
And another question about the derivatives.
Yes.
You mentioned that some derivatives are overridden. It's just as simple as creating your plugin with that ID? Or
so I think that's sort of specific to the entity reference selection that I think in this case looks for an pre-existing derivative.
Oh, okay. So is that
is
the derivative code that needs to take
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure if you in general wrote this, whether it would, which one would win out.
So it depends on the plugin, basically.
Yeah, but
plugin type.
Right, so I think it may be specific to the plugin type, whether this works.
Okay, that's it.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions? No? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. I hope that was informative. Of course, feel free to come and say hi if you want to chat.